Good afternoon from New York City at Columbia University. My name is Tanya Domi, and I am a faculty affiliate of the Harriman Institute, where I teach in the Balkan Studies program. The Harriman Institute at Columbia University is one of the world's leading academic institutions for the study of Russia, Eurasia, and East Central Europe. Our mission is to serve our community at the university and beyond by supporting research, instruction, and dialogue, sponsoring vibrant and multidisciplinary events that bring together our extraordinary resources of faculty, students, and alumni. We are committed to training the next generation of regional specialists to play leadership roles in setting the academic and scholarly agenda, making policy, and challenging accepted truths about how we study our rapidly changing world. The Harriman Institute supported this discussion that we are hosting today in thinking outside of the box of Europe specifically, and in the region more on point. And I am personally delighted to moderate this discussion on the parallels and contrasts between the Balkans and the Middle East with some of the top analysts who have researched and worked on Middle East and Balkan issues. This is a rare discussion that is more frequently ignored or often overlooked. And I give credit to Dr. Dalia Scheinlin, who proposed this discussion to me and with me, and I'm grateful to her in this endeavor among many others that began after we met in Belgrade nearly 7 years ago. So with that introduction, I would like Dr. Scheinlin to make her opening remarks.
Thank you, Tanya, so much. And thank you to the Harriman Institute. I don't know if I deserve the credit, but this is a great opportunity. I thought of so many relevant points for contrast, comparison, consideration, that with great chutzpah, I'm going to try to talk about all 5 of the topics I'd like to try to reach. It's going to be like speed dating. My hope is that I open up questions and topics for future discussion. I won't be able to solve them, of course. I'll just jump right in. I mean, the first, I think, big issue that I want to start with is foreign policy, specifically in terms of global alignment, and the comparison between the 2 regions is most stark in light of the Russia-Ukraine war. And there are 2 countries currently taking an in-between or balancing position on this issue, and that's Serbia and Israel, due to their respective respective very substantive national interests with relation to Russia. The contrast I see here is that Serbia has far more substantive dependence on Russia in many ways that are not able to change overnight. Israel has fewer. Israel has serious considerations in the Middle East, but Serbia also has a big domestic problem if it were to try to fully align with the West. That goes against, in many ways, its identity. Israel does not have that problem. Israel's public opinion is firmly with the West on this issue. And I think in the Middle East, Israel's concern so far has been for cooperation with Russia and Syria, but that is counteracted by the relationship between Russia and Iran, which proves in a way that Israel's sort of neutrality up until now, which is a debatable term, but I'll leave it for later, whatever it is, it did nothing to secure some sort of goodwill on Russia's part. And so I think that if you look at that comparison and contrast, to my mind, there are few excuses for where Israel's position has been on this issue and the neutrality issue. That leads to my second point, which is going to be very brief for now because it's related, and that is regional alignments, which are different from the big global foreign policy alignment. The Middle East is often portrayed as a binary division between Iran and its proxies and militias versus what we used to call the moderate Sunni states. I put that in quotation marks. Now we call them the Abraham Accords alliances, the anti-Iran alliance, and many have compared it to a NATO-style alliance between Western allies and Russia. And in the Middle East, there is even sort of a hope that the Abraham Accords would lead to something like a NATO alliance. Again, I see this as a contrast because it is already the reality in Europe that there is this binary division, made more stark, of course, by the war. But I think that it's neither an accurate description really of where the Middle East is, this idea that everything lines up into a neat binary. Certainly the moderate Sunni state versus the Shia crescent was always an inaccurate picture. And I also think that there's good reason to avoid trying to move it in that direction. I think there are better arguments for avoiding a fixed and confrontational view of this bifurcated, bipolar Middle East. And so I would say, again, we can look at the European divide and probably try not to imitate it. And I'll be happy to explain why in the questions. But that is a segue to my third point, moving right ahead quickly here, which is what kind of country you are. Because when you think about where these countries are in terms of their foreign relations, where they are in the global alignments, it has something to do with whether they're democracies or not. And what the regions share is that Israel and Palestine on the one hand, and the Western Balkans, I am focusing more on Israel-Palestine, that's where I'm focused, that's where I'm based. To some extent, these are areas of striving democracies, okay, leaving aside the rest of the countries in the Middle East for now. And they are striving democracies in areas where festering, unresolved national conflict gets in the way. I would point to two ways in which ongoing conflict disrupts democracy. One is the obvious that even a semi-active conflict can always be an excuse and is an ongoing excuse to suspend democratic norms, advance authoritarian governments for the sake of security or nationalist themes. In Israel, we have an interesting juxtaposition right now between something going in the other direction, in which a violation of democratic norms is boosting conflict extremism. And I will explain very briefly. Our returning prime minister-elect, I should say, Benjamin Netanyahu, has been indicted for corruption. And as a result, the more moderate parties won't go into a coalition with him, which means he is forced to twist his rubber arm. He doesn't mind going into a coalition with the most extreme nationalist figures who are already contributing to escalation in the region. Now that leads to my point number 4, which is, I think, a strong comparison on the issue of conflict management. I think both of these regions, certainly when we're talking about Israel, Palestine, and Serbia, Kosovo is always the best example, there is a great temptation not to bother resolving the conflict, not to strive for this great political resolution, which is too sensitive. And I understand it because there is a genuine fear that the process and the compromises along the way in both places will reignite hostilities and will reignite long-term hostilities and grievances. But I would argue that these are good comparisons because it's bad policy, again, on 2 counts. One is that unresolved conflict will inevitably lead to sudden escalations at some point, whether it's Hebron in Israel and Palestine or Mitrovica, which I hope won't happen. But these can reignite very suddenly, simply due to, small incidents of violence that become, huge. And again, I think this is less likely in Kosovo. I hope it is 100% likely in Israel and Palestine right now. But also ongoing conflict makes it very hard to govern in a stable way. In Israel, we've seen over the last year how the conflict places a dead weight on governance. It is what destroyed issues related to the policy of occupation, destroyed the change coalition that was in place for 1 year until it could not last because of differences between the parties over continuing some of these policies. And I think that unresolved conflict, because it's an open question and an open wound, is not only about the immediate escalation, but on the difficulty of governance. And that leads to my final fifth point, which is how do we get out of unresolved conflict? Okay, what are the comparative models for resolution? Can we learn anything from the examples of the two sides? And I think that if we look at these two regions, the Western Balkans, specifically, let's be honest, former Yugoslavia and Israel and Palestine, we have the full spectrum of approaches to conflict resolution, whether it's complete partition, as in the breakup of Yugoslavia, whether it's failed partition at the other end of the spectrum, like Israel-Palestine, never agreed on partition, never implemented, and still yet refuses to go away as an idea for conflict resolution in terms of the two-state solution. And then we have these hybrids, which are the in-between or power-sharing approaches that have been developed in places like Bosnia. And I think there are elements of power sharing also in Kosovo and North Macedonia. My colleagues will add if there are more. And these are all highly fraught, and they've become very problematic. But I would still say the final contrast is this. Most of the Western Balkans is in a post-conflict environment, except for Serbia, Kosovo, and it's still not an active violent conflict right now. Israel and Palestine are drowning in blood as we speak. It is a terrible time. It is always a terrible time as long as this occupation and conflict is not resolved. I think that it's our historic imperative to look at even these very troubled and fraught power sharing models, the specific mechanisms within them, salvage what has worked and redesign them for our region in order to renew some sort of a vision for long-term comprehensive conflict resolution, political resolution, what we used to call peace. I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dalia. And now I'd like to introduce Haroon Karsic, who's a journalist as the editor-in-chief at Al Jazeera Balkans based in Sarajevo, and he happens to be a political analyst as well. The mic is yours, Haroon.
Hi, Tanya. And thank you so much for organizing this very, very timely event. I've been covering the Middle East and Middle Eastern influences in the Balkans since I enrolled at my master's program in Italy in 2008. That's when I began studying Saudi Arabian, Iranian, and Turkish influence in the Balkans, particularly their activities which led to an Islamic revival during the war and immediately after the war. So I'm mostly focused on the years after the fall of communism and how during the war, Saudi Arabian, Emirati, Qatari, and Egyptian humanitarian organizations and Islamic missionaries made their way towards Bosnia, and along with food packages and medicine, they also disseminated a lot of booklets on Salafi literature, which eventually gave birth to the Salafi movement in Bosnia and the wider Balkan region. I also did a lot of work on Arab foreign fighters who made their way to Bosnia, who joined the Mujahideen unit, and how these things changed afterwards following the end of the war and then the gradual expulsion of Arab fighters from Bosnia beginning in 1997 and until 2002. So what I found out was that this foreign influences from the Middle East, especially Gulf influences, Arab and Iranian influences, had their peak in Bosnia and the wider Balkan region in 2001, 2002. After the 9/11 attacks in 2001, the U.S. Treasury Department began scrutinizing all financial donations which were making their way from the Middle East to the Balkans. And of course, once these transactions were cut off, most of those non-governmental organizations which were active in the Balkans, mostly non-governmental Islamic youth organizations, they no longer had any financial independence to continue their activities in the war, in the region. So from 2004 to 2005 onwards, we see a decrease in Saudi Arabian and Iranian activities in Bosnia, and we see a significant increase in Turkish presence in the country. This also coincides with the coming to power of the AK Party in 2002 to 2003 and their orientation towards former Ottoman lands, particularly the Balkans. But what I wanted to mention here is that, I mean, even though I studied the post-war period, the last 25 years, I was under the impression that during the communist period, from 1945 until 1990, Yugoslavia was completely cut off from the Middle East. However, I came across a lot of documents and information which made me change my mind. And in fact, right now I'm writing a book. I have a contract with a publishing house in London, where which is titled "The Balkans and the Middle East." I'm actually looking into the relations between the Balkan countries, actually Yugoslavia and the Middle East. And I found out that that was actually a thriving relationship between Josip Broz Tito, Muammar Gaddafi, later on Jamal Abdel Nasser, president of Egypt, and later on Saddam Hussein. I mean, as early as in the late 1960s, Iraq began sending its students to study at military academies in Yugoslavia. The Palestinian Liberation Organization began sending its students to study in Sarajevo and elsewhere. We had students from Libya after Gaddafi came to power in 1968. In the 1970s, there was a construction boom where lots of Yugoslav companies, because of Tito's close relations through the NonLine Movement with the Middle East, Yugoslav companies won a lot of lucrative contracts to build dams in Baghdad and Fallujah and Mosul, military barracks, underground bunkers for Saddam Hussein, underground bunkers for Muammar Gaddafi. It's really, really interesting. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was contacted by an Iraqi engineer who spent 2 years, in 1981 to 1983, at an arms factory in Travnik in Bosnia, learning how to make mortars. So he was sent by the Iraqi military and he still speaks Bosnian fluently. So there's a lot of a very intense cooperation between these two countries. And also looking into I began, going through the archive of the Islamic community in Bosnia, and I realized that the Yugoslav government, in fact, made use of the Islamic community in Bosnia as a gate opener towards the Middle East, because the Islamic community, of course, was made up of Muslims who were loyal communists to the socialist government, and every time the government wanted to, make inroads into a certain new market, they would send a couple of delegations, made up of Islamic community officials, people who were Muslims who spoke the Arabic language, to go there and sort of, prepare the terrain as a sort of a soft power projection. So I came across a lot of, official visits by Islamic community officials to Egypt, to Libya, to Algeria, to Morocco, to Lebanon, to Iraq and Syria and elsewhere throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And in fact, in 1989, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the current leader of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, who was then held a different position, he visited Belgrade, and there are video footages of him visiting Belgrade and meeting with high-ranking Yugoslav officials. And he skipped official protocol, got on his car, and drove to Sarajevo with his aides, and visited the Gazi Husar Beg Mosque in Sarajevo. He in fact prayed there. So this all goes to show us that relations between Yugoslavia and the Yugoslav Muslims and the Middle East, in fact, were thriving throughout. Let's say thriving, but they were very, very much very active during the communist period. And the communist government, in fact, very cleverly made use of its Muslim population and the Islamic community in Bosnia to open the gates of the Middle East to win very lucrative, construction projects, arms deals, and so on and so forth. If you look at it from a wider perspective, it makes a lot of sense. Barely 170, 180 years ago, Bosnia and Iraq and Syria and Saudi Arabia and Yemen were the same state. They were the Ottoman state. There are documents in the Gazi Husar Beg Library today showing you that Bosnian rebels, Bosnian Muslim rebels, were sent into exile into the deserts of Saudi Arabia and Yemen in the 1840s and 1850s. There are documents showing you that high-ranking, Syrian officials and military inspectors visited the Balkans and inspected Ottoman military units. So there was a lot of cooperation. So I do believe that after the collapse of communism, these relations are being once again reestablished. However, what I do notice is that during the communist period, Yugoslavia maintained relations through the non-aligned movement with non-aligned countries such as primarily with Egypt, Libya, and Iraq, and Algeria. After the collapse of communism, Serbia tried sort of to revitalize the non-aligned movement and reinvigorate those relations with Arab states. But I'll get back to that later. But Gulf countries, primarily Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar, sort of rediscovered the Balkans in the 1990s and began, making their ways towards the region. What is interesting to note is relations between Serbia and the PLO. Many people still think that Bosnian Muslims are very pro-Palestinian, but this is only true to a certain extent. What is interesting to note is that the Palestinian Liberation Organization maintains very close relations with the government of Serbia here in the 1990s, which means the government of Slobodan Milosevic. So much so that in the year 2000, Yasser Arafat invited Slobodan Milosevic to celebrate Orthodox Christmas in Bethlehem. And Slobodan Milosevic accepted that invitation, and he was just about to go there. And then there was already an international arrest warrant for him, and the Israelis told him, if you land in Israel, we're going to arrest you for war crimes committed against Bosnian Muslims and Kosovar Albanians. So here we have an example of Palestinians inviting the butcher of the Balkans, the PLO inviting the butcher of the Balkans, and Israelis telling him, hey, we're going to arrest you as soon as you land in Israel because you're wanted by the hate tribunal. And after Milosevic was toppled, Ivica Dačić continued, and Tomislav Nikolic, President Tomislav Nikolic of Serbia, continued their relations with the PLO, and they in fact visited Ramallah a couple of times. Laid flowers to Yasser Arafat's grave and so on and so forth. And there are still, of course, on a much lower scale, exchange of students between the two countries. So this is. Yeah.
I just want to say, Haroon, we need to move to the next speaker.
Sure. Okay, we'll get back to it.
Thank you. It's very interesting history, which I was not aware of. That's very enlightening. Our next panelist is Dr. Kurt Basinger, who's co-founder and senior associate of the Democratization Policy Council. Kurt, you have the mic.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm going to try to be, I'm going to reorder my presentation in relation to what Dalia had said, just to sort of reframe it. I mean, one of the biggest, I would call it a macro parallel between the Western Balkans and the Middle East, North Africa region is the sense that things are not over. The ball is still in play. The differentiation is the posture and relative leverage of the democratic world, the West, which is not the sum total of the democratic world, but and that's where the policy of the EU, US, and UK and others is failing in the Balkans, because when we got steeped and deeply engaged in the late 1990s, particularly after the war in Kosovo, the aim was to be clear that these state borders are going to remain. We're not going to allow violent conflict. Anybody who tries violent conflict, it was implied we're going to stomp on them. And that understanding does not pertain now. Now, whatever agenda exists seems open, and that's part of the problem that we're facing. So it feeds the maximalist agendas, of which there are many in the region. And the perverse problem is the West has more leverage in the Western Balkans structurally than anywhere else on the planet outside its own frontiers. So there's a question of why we're allowing those with anti-democratic, authoritarian, nationalist agendas to define the terms. One of the manifestations of this is what I call a peace cartel. And I'd say this pertains in Bosnia and North Macedonia in the Western Balkans, but you could even call the whole region a macro peace cartel. And it pertains in Lebanon and probably Iraq as well. What these are power sharing arrangements arrived at through international brokerage between erstwhile conflicting actors. And it's power sharing, it's power allocation. In effect, what these deals do is allow these parties to conflict, later, democratic actors, full spectrum dominance, politics, economics, media, across the board. And they're highly resilient, highly durable. They could absorb new actors, and they perpetuate themselves because there's no better deal on offer. Even the offer of membership in the European Union has not changed the power dynamic, because this is the happy hunting ground for these guys. They can remain unaccountable politically and legally. They can keep what they stole and keep stealing. This is what Lebanese were protesting against in 2019 when they were saying all of them means all of them. I think that phrase would be equally pertinent in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And even in North Macedonia, which is not as recognized as having this perverse dynamic, this is the country that's come closest to having the opportunity to change its system. I would posit they had an opportunity, but the SDSM, when they came to power, decided this is great. We're happy to not change the system, and basically aim to appease the West by dealing with a real problem, the name issue. But in terms of what they had the actual power to control, in terms of the way power was allocated and accountability, they didn't deal with it. Another parallel is the bottom-up potential in each region that either requires assembly or galvanization for concrete alternatives to what people are living through, because there's enormous dissatisfaction at the popular level in a number of these countries. But the problem is people know what they're against, but they haven't articulated what they're for. And there has not been any real political incentive to develop a political vehicle for those options. One of the problems, and this is a parallel, and this is strange. I mean, on one hand, the West, particularly the European Union, but also NATO, has a posture that allows a lot more leverage over the governments and social dynamics in these countries than it does in Middle East and North Africa. And the West's leverage has dissipated, as we all know, in the past decade, quite a bit. But the idée fixe for policymakers is the migration issue. So there, I think the Western Balkans are effectively treated like the rest of the Mediterranean littoral in terms of what policymakers actually care about the most. And this is something that first Mikola Gruevski in Macedonia, now Alexander Vučić, others, the Croatians infamously in terms of the way they push people back into Bosnia. This is something that they exploit. And so long as that remains the focal point, these guys are going to be able to take advantage of it. The reason I call the governments peace cartels is they could threaten to end the peace anytime they want, and therefore they use that not only to suppress potential resistance in their societies and keep people in their lanes, but they use that to extract concessions from the West. And basically, they know that the powers that be in the democratic world, the most they want out of the Western Balkans is pacification, quiet. They want it not to be a problem. And they could say, no, you better give us what we want or we'll make a problem. These issues are you have a cordon sanitaire mentality toward the entire region. You could bunch them together. And this is where we're sort of stuck in the enlargement framework right now. Final point, and I know I'm out of time, is that citizens in Western Balkans can take advantage of legal structures, including the European Court of Human Rights, that is not available to people in the Middle East and North Africa. And they have availed themselves of it. And so there is that sort of values-based network of institutions, intergovernmental, so forth, that the Middle East, North Africa doesn't have, despite discussion of, say, the Abraham Accords signatories in the same frame. Nothing has been organized on an intergovernmental level and certainly not on a values basis. That's absent.
Thank you, Kurt, very much. So our next speaker is Diana Mukanovic, who's a PhD candidate at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. She's also a visiting research fellow at the Post-Conflict Research Center in Sarajevo, and also participates in the Psychology of Intergroup Conflict and Reconciliation Lab at Hebrew University in Israel. Diana, you have the mic, and you should, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Tanya, for inviting me to speak on this panel. I'm really excited to be here with everyone else to discuss the ways in which the Balkans and the Middle East are connected, which some of our speakers already talked about, and also to think about ways that they can be compared and contrasted. I also want to thank the audience members for taking the time out of their busy days to be with us today and discuss this important topic with us. So I'm going to actually take us down to the micro level and talk specifically about the research that I am conducting that is related to the topic of this panel. And the subject of this panel has been of interest to me for over a decade. I began thinking about it originally when I moved to Israel in 2011 to study international conflict resolution. And from the onset, I began to notice important similarities in the discourse surrounding intergroup relations in Israel and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so my conviction that a comparison between Israel and Bosnia and Herzegovina is valuable and can add new insights into intergroup conflict only strengthened during the 6 years that I spent studying and working as a practitioner in international human rights and development in Israel. And since 2017, I've actually been studying and researching the subject as part of my dissertation. And as Tanya already mentioned, I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Pittsburgh in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. And my dissertation research deals with the nature of cross-ethnic interpersonal relationships in ethnically polarized spaces with the experience of intergroup violence. I know that's a mouthful. For this purpose, I've actually been interviewing just ordinary people about their relationships with ethnic others or those who belong to other ethnic groups within these 2 places or 3 places if you count the occupied Palestinian territories or really occupied East Jerusalem, which is the only part of it that I do research on. And so in so doing, in doing these interviews, I've actually learned about the lives and personalities of these individuals and how they experience their relationship with ethnic others and the perceived strengths and weaknesses of those relationships. I also actually conduct participant observations. So I also observe spaces where ethnic groups are most or least likely to have contact. I focus on the major ethnic groups that represent the fault lines alongside which group violence occurred in the past or continues to occur. So I'm currently actually in Sarajevo, wrapping up about 9 months of dissertation fieldwork in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is where I'm originally from as well. And before that, I spent 5 months in Israel and the occupied East Jerusalem doing the same. I like to point out that I don't directly compare the Balkans and the Middle East in my research, nor even Bosnia and Herzegovina and Israel and the occupied East Jerusalem. Instead, what I do is I use rich data to obtained from like a broad cross-section of societies in these 2 places to triangulate my findings, allowing me to generalize with greater confidence about the nature of interpersonal cross-ethnic relationships in places which have prior or continued experience of intergroup violence. And I've been actually using the Mediterranean region as the analytical lens through which to examine this topic of my research and link together different geographical spaces that I study. And this is like not new. It's not something I invented. You know, this is a well-established framework for analysis that claims its own experts, journals, academic programs, and so on. But what it's important is that it attributes a certain level of uniqueness to the Mediterranean region owing to the shared historical, political, religious, and cultural connections that exist across state boundaries within this broad geographic space. And more specifically, like if I'm asked, I will say, I deal with the East Mediterranean, which is an even narrower geographic space with particularly high concentration of ethnically polarized spaces that have seen recurrent violence along ethnic lines. My research is concerned more with the consequences of ethnic divisions rather than their causes, but the two are, of course, intrinsically linked. And what I think what is maybe different or unique, at least in this discussion, is that I really focused on the individual level. Mine is an individual level analysis because I focus specifically on the experiences of everyday people and how they navigate such these environments. And the preliminary evidence of my dissertation research, which I share with some consternation because the analysis is incomplete, and but most apparently it reveals a discrepancy between this like political rhetoric regarding intergroup relations that often portrays like these insurmountable rifts between ethnic groups, their goals and their interests, and the subjective experiences of ordinary people in their interaction with ethnic others. Individuals of diverse ethnicities, backgrounds, experiences, ideologies, levels of religiosity, ages, gender, you name it, can and do maintain relationships with ethnic others. Prejudice does not seem to determine the likelihood of cross-ethnic relationships, as individuals who report prejudice views can also maintain cross-ethnic relationships, and not everyone who is open-minded, quote unquote, does maintain such relationships. So whether a cross-ethnic relationship forms seems to be more about having an opportunity to meet and bond with ethnic others, which points to structural factors that enable and impede those opportunities. And there are also notable differences between Israel and the occupied East Jerusalem on the one hand and Bosnia and Herzegovina on the other. The type of structural limitations that impede cross-ethnic relationships have existed for much longer in Israel and the occupied East Jerusalem than in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I have a lot more to say, but I'll close off here and I'll hand it back to Tanya. And I really look forward to discussing this further and answering any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I do want to tell our audience that unfortunately, Ralph Beirovich has not been able to call in or connect with us. He's in Frankfurt, and I'm sorry, it doesn't appear that we're going to have his input. So let me I just want to ask a couple of questions. First to Dalia. On this new government in Jerusalem, and Netanyahu has been indicted, I know that we're now in this period where they're going to take the opportunity to form the government, and they get an extension of 14 days to do that, correct? I mean, I think that's right. And that it's interesting that Biden, called him and congratulated him. And then there was some noise out of Washington saying, well, it's a right-wing government. We're not sure we're going to keep funding to Israel under these circumstances. So, but I don't know if that's really serious or not. And with a split Congress, there may not be any movement at all. We'll see what happens. What are your thoughts on that, Dalia?
Well, I don't think we're going to see any radical change on the part of the U.S. government policy towards Israel in terms of funding. I think the most progressive voices, in anywhere, but certainly in the administration, but I mean, really more coming from Congress and congressional Democrats, is that there should be some sort of restriction on the nature of the aid to make sure that it is not being used for purposes that advance, aggressive actions and occupation, something along the lines of the Leahy law. But these are, I mean, after years of talking about it, there's these kinds of things that we hear still seem to be very preliminary. And obviously the issue is toxic in the US. It's very hard to have an open conversation saying we should really redesign, although there have been some more mainstream figures who are not in government, former diplomats, et cetera, saying that there should be a tougher, more restrictive policy, or more, I should say, more circumspect policy. It's, hardly even a framing of toughness, but more, restrictions on how American aid is actually being used, including a recent op-ed in the Washington Post by Aaron David Miller and Daniel Kurtzner, both seasoned diplomats on the U.S., the U.S. Middle East Israel front. So these voices are out there, but I don't think we're going to see radical change, especially because of the next phase of American elections. Nobody's going to want to risk I mean, it's already an issue that plays so deeply into American politics, even ahead of the midterms, that I think that the Democrats are just not complacent and not going to be in any position to take significant risks on this. And if your question is about, on the Israeli side, what kind of government are we looking at? I don't know if you want me to open that up, but I think that just for anybody who isn't clear on this, where we are now is that after the elections, the right-wing parties, the right-wing and religious parties have a majority. They are negotiating the terms of the coalition that they anticipate they will be able to establish. We're hearing roller coaster ups and downs, but everybody expects pretty much that they will establish that coalition either within the initial 30 days or maybe with an extension. It would be less likely at this point, but if they cannot reach agreement, there has been some talk about, Netanyahu trying to form a coalition with some of the centrist parties, but it seems that is almost completely off the table right now. Because despite the ups and downs, the coalition negotiations do seem to be moving ahead towards establishing a government with these very, very radical figures who, some of these parties represent the same kinds of schools of thought that have been actually banned by Israeli politics back in the 1980s, followers of Meir Kahane, and these very extremist, violent movements. So it is a dangerous time. And I would put one more thing out there as an answer to this question about what is this new government going to look like. One of the issues that I think is the most central in a way, even underlying everything else, because it is the biggest turning point, is the attack on Israel's institutions and specifically the Israeli judiciary. That has been a little bit off the map for many international observers. I think it should be on the map. What we're seeing in terms of escalation of the conflict, frankly and sadly, it's been ongoing for 55 years and 70, it's over 70 years. But the undermining Israel's judiciary will basically cut out the legs of any remaining arena for even challenging those policies. Not that the Supreme Court has been on the side of those who oppose occupation and escalation, but it is a forum where they can get a fair hearing, and there are occasional advances, and it's at least the forum where you can preserve a democratic, anything like a democratic culture. So I think that is the biggest danger that the entire region faces. The Israel-Palestine region.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to come back, though, and talk about U.S. foreign policy, because what we're seeing in the Balkans right now is we're seeing a U.S. foreign policy, quite frankly, in my view, is upside down and actually has been aiding and abetting some of the worst nationalistic impulses, not only in Bosnia, but more broadly throughout the region. And you're also seeing a U.S. foreign policy. And when Blinken made his first trip to the Middle East, it seems like, it's just caretaking. There's no initiatives here. There's nothing that's going to really engage in a paradigmatic shift on these frozen conflicts or addressing these festering conflicts in the Middle East or even in the Balkans. That I want to come back and talk about that. But to you, Kurt, you've been talking about these comparisons, Lebanon, Iraq, with the Balkans, North Macedonia, and Bosnia, and the fact that they're peace cartels, more or less, as you've defined. What's the way out of this, stopping short of effective foreign policy, also by bilaterals in the EU and the US?
Well, you have more tools to apply in the Western Balkans. So I would argue there's therefore a greater responsibility. But in Iraq, the United States at least had a lot of influence. I still think it maintained some. Lebanon's tougher. But starting with Bosnia Herzegovina and North Macedonia, simply because that's an area where we control a lot of the environment, or we could if we so chose. I think being realistic about what we can and can't do is important. We can't fix Bosnia Herzegovina. We can create a conducive environment for those Bosnians and Herzegovinians who want something different, which I would posit is an overwhelming majority of the citizens there. I'll put it very starkly, if I felt that you could not find a modus vivendi among 75–80% of the citizens there, and that's a guesstimate but that's based on some data and lived experience. I would walk away. I have more confidence at the popular level in Bosnia-Herzegovina and North Macedonia than I do in the United States right now, which terrifies me. I'm not happy to say that, but I believe that's the case. So it's not insurmountable at the popular level, but the problem is if you have a policy that allows all the unfulfilled agendas to be pursued without restraint. I mean, I'll give a very stark example. You have an openly irredentist policy being pursued by Belgrade called Srpski Svet, Serbian World. It's both a rebranding of Greater Serbia and a direct and conscious analog of Ruski Mir, Russian World, which was the justification or provide the substrate for Putin's invasion of Ukraine. I could find only one case where a Western official criticized that. That was Ambassador Chris Hill last July, found it in Srpski Informer or Telegraph or one of Vucic's papers. But I couldn't find anything else. Now, it wasn't an exhaustive search, but it certainly has not been a front and center focal point the way it would have been 20 years ago when we were talking about a Europe whole, free, and at peace. That's directly antithetical to all the values bases of integration you're talking about. So it's not a tools problem. It's not a resources problem. It is a philosophical problem. And the biggest problem is nobody cares enough in the Western corridors of power. And so I think that would be, these divided societies were divided for a reason. They were divided for profit. The people who profited the most are still in power. And I think most people know they've been had. So I think there's cause for very acerbic optimism. But right now, everybody who's for progress in these societies, and I'd include Lebanon in this, is fighting uphill against everybody, against the local potentates who have no reason to change their tune. In a weird way, I don't even blame them because, the house always wins. But we have the power to change it, but we don't care enough. So, there's a singular target, which is basically we're working for our geopolitical adversaries. Our policies are helping the Russians and the Chinese and the Turks. And we don't want to see that far. So there's everything to play for here. But with absent a policy shift on our part, and I think the most likely locus for that will be people being more vocal for something different. And if that doesn't happen, then you're on a glide path to these countries becoming refugee camps and old folks' homes run by oligarchs or autocrats. Take your pick between which country, depending on the system.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, Haroon, I watched your recent interview of Admiral that you talked to, Fifth Fleet. He had led the Fifth. Yeah. It was a very good interview. And one of the things that keeps coming across here, and that's why I mentioned it earlier about U.S. foreign policy, is this retraction of U.S. leadership, retraction in the Middle East, retraction in the Balkans. And just as Kurt described, we have the capacity, the United States has the capacity, but they're not willing to exercise it. A lot of people with regard to the Balkans have actually been turning to London, despite the calamitous situation in that government. It's probably got a more affirmative, more forward-leaning foreign policy, not leveraged to the extent that it could be. And when they mirror the United States, it isn't necessarily a good thing. So how do you see this in relationship to the Balkans, as well as your really close-up look at Middle Eastern countries? You did have this discourse with this admiral that really took the United States to task. And I'll just throw in, because it's part of the region, is the shambolic exit from Afghanistan, I think really opened the door. And I think that's one of the reasons why Putin moved on Ukraine. He really didn't believe there was going to be a response. What's your view on?
When the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan, um, uh, many people in Bosnia, I'm a journalist. I know many people. I've been working in Al Jazeera for 11 years. Many people began wondering, how would Bosnia look like if the U.S. pulled out? I mean, of course, there's far fewer troops in Bosnia than in Afghanistan. How would Bosnia look like if the U.S. completely pulled out, militarily and politically? What would be left of the country? And you know, people are generally afraid that it would create a security vacuum, a void which would most likely be filled by other external actors. And when I say external actors, I don't only mean Russia, China, Turkey, but also Croatia and Serbia. Let's bear in mind that Croatia and Serbia still have, regardless of which political party in fact is in power, they still have irredentist aspirations towards Bosnia. And of course, over the last 2 months, President Milanovic has been openly lobbying for Croatian troops to be stationed within Bosnia as well. And of course, in addition to the Srpski Svijet, which we just heard about. In January this year, the situation in Bosnia was so tense. So much so, following the 9th of January parade in Banja Luka, it was so tense that people who work in the international organizations, such as myself and some of my friends who work in various embassies, began renewing their passports and withdrawing their foreign cash reserves from banks. They were so sure that a war was going to break out. With Dodik's warmongering rhetoric, with all the talk about secession, with Russia amassing troops, and then when Russia invaded Ukraine in February, people were sure that if Kiev had fallen, a war would break out in Bosnia. And just because Dodik saw how strongly Ukraine was being defended with the help of Western arms and money and weapons weapons as well, he decided to delay his plans. That he actually made it quite clear. He said, "We have delayed our secession, our plans for independence because of the war in Ukraine." So people in Bosnia are watching very closely what is happening in Ukraine, and they're definitely able to associate themselves with the fight of the Ukrainians. I am afraid that when you compare the Balkans and the Middle East, once the U.S. began slowly decreasing its troop numbers in Iraq and Afghanistan, we saw, of course, in the case of Iraq, Iran gain a much more prominent role with its Hashd al-Shabi paramilitary forces and the various other Kitab Hezbollah militias in Iraq, and of course before that in Lebanon as well. And now in the case of Bosnia, of course, ever since the U.S. outsourced its peacekeeping operations to EUFOR in 2004 and later on, in the period between 2004 and 2006, the security situation has been deteriorating. So we are afraid that if this trend continues, Russia, definitely with the help of Serbia, can make use of the political instability to create trouble in the region. It would be a tit for tat approach, so-called, towards the U.S. because Russia has been considering, NATO's pro-Western or Ukraine's pro-Western orientation and Georgia's pro-Western orientation and their relations with the U.S. as an encroachment into its sphere of influence and interest zone. So they feel like they have the right to hit back at the West, and the softest region where they can hit back Europe's underbelly is the Balkans. And of course, whatever happens in the Balkans will not stay in the Balkans. Bear in mind that Bosnia neighbors to NATO member states, Croatia and Montenegro. And in the case of any conflict in Bosnia, this will definitely involve maybe Serbia, maybe Croatia, and you never know, maybe even Montenegro.
Yeah, those are all really interesting points and valid. Diana, you're looking at the really micro level of society, And there's so many, really great NGOs that I know of in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I mean, you're a scholar fellow at an organization that I happen to be the president of the advisory board of the Post-Conflict Research Center, doing a lot of great work. But also in Israel, there's a lot of NGOs, not only in Israel, but also in the West Bank, Gaza, that are doing really important work, and they're facing obstacles, particularly in the human rights framework. They're facing obstacles every day. Travel just out of the occupied territories is very, very difficult. People can't go to get into Israel. They can't even leave many times. There was a student that applied at Columbia that I was aware of, and it was Palestinian. We could not get him out. He was accepted at Columbia and we could not get him out, which is really heartbreaking. So can you talk about that in terms of people living in these situations where there are just so many obstacles and oppression, and yet people are trying to work together to address these issues?
Yes, no, that's a great question. I mean, there really is a lot to say on that topic. I mean, I'll try to point out maybe a few things that I think have been, I've been thinking about them a lot, because I used to work also as a practitioner in these programs, like the one at PCRC that I'm now, an organization for which I'm now a fellow. Which is all of, intergroup dialogue and coexistence programs, particularly in Israel. That's the work that I did. And I think what my research, I think, sort of helps to highlight or identify is that, number one, these programs are important. The work of these organizations really is important, especially in spaces where you have all these pressures, political pressures from various sides. You have a lot of both political parties, not in the official sense, but political entities, let's say, but also grassroots entities that wish to maintain a sort of division and to kind of maybe not intentionally to perpetuate conflict, but they have no interest in resolving it. I think that, having these organizations continue their work is really valuable. I think the question really comes, and I think that's what my research tries to get at, is what is the change that these organizations are making? Are they actually convincing people who are unlikely to want to cooperate to do so? And I think the answer is they're not. They're not very likely to convince people who don't want to cooperate, but that doesn't mean that their role is not important. They still provide a platform for the people who want to do so to do so. And that's a really, really valuable role to have, because it provides, allows them to become a social force, as opposed to just being, fragmented individuals who have shared goals. So I think that that's the important thing. But then also, I think another interesting thing that that I try to also tend to in my research is what should we be looking for when we're looking for cooperation? Like what is a sign? I mean, what is even a sign of cooperation? And what does it even mean to get groups to cooperate? Like, I mean, in literature, there's a whole discourse about like, is there anything as groups in the first place? But we won't get into that one right now. But I mean, what does it really mean? And I think that, and how do we achieve it? And I think that, the perspective that I take from my research is that, what we need to, and this is of course also supported by other research that shows that actually relationship building on the individual level is really important. Because it helps to create networks, and networks are actors that can operate with intention, and what helps create them is relationships. But relationships don't get created by just having people come together and hang out over lunch and state their shared views. or maybe differing views and just hearing each other out. It requires a continuous sort of effort to provide spaces where people can meet and talk and establish, I would use the word intimacy, really, maybe not in the traditional sense, but like intimacy in a sense of like closeness of relationship, a bond with other people. And I think that, you know, that's maybe, I mean, that's where grassroots organizations are generally focused in any case. They're focused on the individual, but I think just maybe fine tuning that a little bit to have like a very intentional focus on not on reaching everyone, because I really do think that unfortunately not everyone can be reached, but to really adequately support the people that are dedicated to intergroup dialogue and cooperation.
Thanks very much for that. I mean, I think that's a reality, and we don't, when we're talking about foreign policy and by you know, our bilateral partners, we're not ever really talking about the people that are actually living there and what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And so I wanted to get your input on this. I'm going to share, Ralph has actually texted to me his comments on Turkey, and we did ask him to address Turkey, which has a very interesting relationship with Israel and with the Middle East in terms of trade. I'm just going to throw this out here, and I'd like to get some reactions from Dalia, Kurt, and Haroon. He's asserting that Turkish influence in the region, in the Balkans, is actually not as consequential as some people may think. He also is saying that the Balkans is very important domestic political issue for Turkey, and that this actually kind of bounces around in that political space and creates considerable political pressure on whoever is in power in Turkey, and they are more or less pressured to support Bosnia, Kosovo, and Albania, and the domestic political dynamic is often overlooked by Western observers at Turkish Balkans policy through the angle of Ottomanism or Islamism. And he said much more to the point, Turkey is much more willing to cooperate with non-Muslim populations than reported. And indeed, Serbia is the champion of the economic cooperation with Turkey. They are the largest recipient of Turkish foreign aid in the Balkans. A lot of people don't realize that, but I'm certainly aware of it. And these political ties often fly under the radar. For example, when Vuk Jeremic was elected as the UN General Assembly president 10 years ago, the Erdogan government was able to not only help them, but also continued helping the Bosniaks and Albanians at the same time. So it's a real interesting player between the Balkans and the Middle East. And I think the Israeli relationship with Turkey is very unique. And I'd like to go to you, Dalia, first to make comments.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I have to say I smiled a little bit when he said, you know, that there's a domestic issue of the Balkans and Turkey, whoever's in power. What do you mean whoever's in power? We know who's in power. I will say that Turkey is, as you point out, very interesting. I think that there's a couple of things that came up in my mind while you were talking. One is that we see what's happening now in Syria, which I think is a direct result, to my mind, and I'm not a Syria expert, but I do think that it's a direct result to some extent of the perception that Russia's, you know, influence is weakening. I'm assuming. And that Turkey may be identifying now. I mean, Turkey has been vying for, you know, more influence, a bigger footprint in the Middle East on some level for some years, but it wasn't quite sure. I feel like over the last few years, there was a bit of a slowdown, at least I was, you know, other than its role in Syria. And I have a feeling that with Russia being weakened now in terms of its role in Syria, we're going to see more Turkish presence. In terms of the general point that he made, I think is very interesting because it seems intuitively right. I mean, Erdogan has is nothing if not pragmatist on some level. I don't think he would put ideology or identity, Islamic politics somehow or kinship above, hard pragmatism. And, the rift with Israel that began around 2010 came after many years of cooperation between the countries, some of them under Erdogan. And that, as we've seen over time, okay, there is certainly, a matter of I guess you could call it the ideological support for the Palestinians during those years of a real disconnect between the two countries on some level. But I think that when he came to the realization that it was serving his interests to go back, there have been over the years efforts at revival, and they will continue in that direction. And to the extent that the Palestinians were somehow depending on Turkey to be a stalwart supporter forever, I don't think that's the case. I think that Erdogan he's a realist in that sense. He will continue to develop the kinds of working relationships needed. Especially this year, we saw new levels of cooperation. It was helpful when there was a different government after Netanyahu, because much of the deterioration happened under Netanyahu's government, and it was a combination of personal insults and, of course, over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is ideological. However, the fact that Netanyahu is returning doesn't necessarily mean, though, that the progress under the previous government will be rolled back. And if it continues, I guess that, to my mind, I think there is a more open road for continued, advancement. Let's say a less aggressive, advance than, for example, Russia's footprint in the Middle East since 2015. But I think it will continue, and it is a hard and aggressive approach in Syria. And I'm not exactly sure where it's going to lead. I mean, we were chatting offline. Sorry, the audience doesn't know about who are the hegemons in the Western Balkan region and in the Middle East. In the Middle East, we have a crowded field of very influential players. We have Israel, we have Iran, we have Saudi, we have the Gulf states, Qatar, depending on who you want to include in that as regional hegemons. And if Turkey and Russia has had this very influential role, it could be that Turkey is going to be as much of a player as it has sometimes seemed like it wants to be in the Middle East as well.
Thank you very much, Kurt.
Yeah, well, I did just to
I know you guys are having this conversation online. This is good. Go ahead.
No. This is. I mean, just responding to Rayouf's point. I mean,
sure.
Turkey has demonstrated a very unsentimental approach in the Western Balkans.
That's what I meant to say. Unsentimental. As
Rayouf alluded, though there are party relationships, I think the Erdogan-Izetbegovic relationship is quite tight, and I think what that implies to me is that Erdogan could find a way to make this all add up, because I think there's still a strain in SDA that is fine with the idea of partition as long as they get a piece that they control. I don't trust them any more than I trust any of the other players, and that I worry about that because that's a way you could find a modus vivendi between the agendas of, say, Russia and Turkey, and that worries me.
Haroon, so I know, Haroon, that you know quite a bit about Turkey.
Well, let me just answer, follow up on Kurt's point. I'm not sure that Erdogan's relationship with Izetbegovic is as tight as he wants to demonstrate it to the public. I talk quite often to Izetbegovic's advisors, and I know a couple of advisors of Ibrahim Kalin, who is Erdogan's spokesperson and chief foreign policy advisor. Basically, Bakir Izetbegovic does not really have open access to Erdogan. He likes to present it as such towards the wider Bosnian audience, but this is simply not true. Bosnia doesn't really, Bosnia and Bakir Izetbegovic not really rate quite well with on a list of on a level of importance to Erdogan. Of course, nowhere as important as Azerbaijan, the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus, or Qatar. And whatever Erdogan had of this, and Izetbegovic had of this relationship, it has definitely been deteriorated, because over the past couple of years, since the failed coup d'etat attempt in 2016, Erdogan has been pressuring Izetbegovic to arrest and deport a number of
Yes,
journalists, affiliated
right.
intellectuals, and teachers who live in Sarajevo. Bosnia, though it may be a failed state, it still has some semblance of a rule of law, and it's not that easy to arrest and deport people from the country. And I know that Erdogan has been quite annoyed with Izetbegovic not being able to deport any of those journalists in Bosnia, who still continue running a vast network of university, high schools, primary schools, media outlets, publishing houses, and so on and so forth. I would also agree with what Rauf said. Yes, Turkey is very pragmatic, and it follows a realpolitik line when it comes to the Balkans. It's very much look, during Davutoglu's era. Davutoglu, I know him personally. We are family friends. He had a very rosy view of the Balkans. He really wanted to help people, because of his genuine sympathies towards Balkan Muslims. Once that failed, and once he was out of power, and once Turkey realized that their support for the Muslim Brotherhood and for revolutionary government, revolutionary organizations throughout the Middle East at the beginning of the Arab Spring was a total failure, and that counter-revolutionary regimes such as the UAE and Saudi Arabia had won effectively, Erdogan and the Turkish government decided that the best way was to begin mending ties with the ancient regimes of the Middle East. This, of course, explains to you why Erdogan is now apparently willing to meet Bashar al-Assad, why Erdogan, after so many years, met President Sisi, why Erdogan met in Qatar at the World Cup, why Erdogan met with Mohammed bin Salman and with Mohammed bin Zayed. Turkey realized that it needs to run a very pragmatic foreign policy. When it comes to foreign investments and bilateral trade, Turkey has a far higher bilateral trade with non-Muslim Balkan countries such as Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania. I will stop here. Just one more thing.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Compared Bosnia to Serbia, Turkey there are 400 Turkish-owned and registered companies in Serbia. Bosnia, there are 36.
Wow, that really does, that puts it in stark relief. I want to go back to Diana, and I want to do a little shout out here. What you were talking about, how, you just can't go and hang out together and expect to create solidarity. And it just so happens that I did a podcast last year. I'm not even sure I told Dahlia about it, with Kevin Racklin and contestant former Combatants for Peace, which is a great NGO that has a Palestinian executive director and an Israeli executive director. And I think those people are actually doing some really consequential work. What are your thoughts about that kind of framework for an NGO that's very clear that they're working together, shoulder to shoulder, on really difficult issues?
Absolutely. I mean, that really sort of goes along with what I was saying earlier, is that, that is exactly the kind of platform that we want to provide, which is a space where perhaps like-minded people who are already inclined to work on these issues can do so. They get the resources to do so. They can meet each other. They even have even something basic as they have a space to meet. They have a whole institution behind them that can facilitate some administrative or overcome administrative issues, such as, for getting licenses for Palestinians to cross and meet when on special events or something to that effect. I don't know if Combatants for Peace do things like that specifically, but I'm just saying in general, it is something that is valuable for these organizations. The only thing that I would say is, again, what I sort of pointed to earlier is that maybe the goal of these because I feel like there's constantly, and having worked in these organizations, I can say with confidence that there's always this pressure to show that you're making an impact, and the impact is quantitatively presented, meaning that you're saying that I have 20 participants now, and I can have 40 next year, and I can have 70 next year, and that's how I demonstrate success. And what I'm suggesting, and I think that's what my research also gets at, is like, it's not about quantity, it's about quality. It's about how well do these 20 people who come together, and maybe another 5 who come next year, and maybe 2 who come the year after, work together, and what impact do they make? Because a very few people can actually make a lot of impact, as we can see with individual politicians and so on and so forth from all of these discussions we've had.
Right.
So I think like just the shift needs to change, that we need to really focus on the quality rather than the quantity, because this intergroup collaboration is important.
So Dahlia, thank you so much, Dahlia, your comments.
Yeah, I just want to weigh in a little bit because I'm also very familiar with all these organizations. I work with many of these NGOs in my capacity as looking at public opinion research, looking at the impact. I'm completely familiar, I think we all are, with the dynamic that the donors have to see the progress and impact. And so they have to find indicators. Since I'm the person who's often asked to help find the indicators, I have to be very honest. A lot of times it's artificial. I mean, I do my job. I try to make an indicator. They are searching genuinely. But we know that that kind of impact doesn't happen in half a year or on a big quantitative scale. I will say one thing, Deanna, just about specifically on Combatants for Peace. They are one of the few groups, I think, that do not only cater to like-minded people who are already inclined, because they are people who were militants. They were either, some of them were Hamas figures on the Palestinian side or Israeli soldiers, and for whatever reason, they had a change of heart, or many of them will tell their stories and say they heard a lecture or a conversation with one of the participants and then began a process, or they went through something. They're also very close with another group that might be worth mentioning called the Bereaved Families Forum, of people who have lost somebody directly as a victim of the conflict, and then people have gone through a process of trying to become more open to the other. But I will say that, not to sound too depressed, because these are my best friends and colleagues in all of these organizations, but I do want to make the point that I have become, after 25 years of living in the region, I think that there are limits to how much any kind of dialogue for its own sake will help. And somebody crystallized this for me, kind of put it into words, my suspicions that it's not enough. And that person was somebody in the Balkans who said, and this is now, this is 10 years ago, and it was a public interview anyway, for my research. And the person said, he was a Kosovo Albanian who said, we didn't go to war with the Serbs because we didn't know them well enough. That person is now the Prime Minister of Kosovo. And I think we all know what he means. And at least I understand that, because I've seen it in Israel-Palestine, and therefore I have come to a different approach, which is not unrelated. But I think that we need to all be looking much more at the kinds of interactions you have over shared needs and actual, pragmatic interests that people need to do, whether they like each other or not. That's why I'm much more interested in things like cooperation over climate and environmental issues. I'd like to shout out to the work of my colleagues over at the Friends of the Earth Ecopeace, who are doing terrific work and have put together policy papers and helped advance what actually turned into an agreement between Israel and Jordan over this last year called the Green-Blue deal, and I hope will one day include the Palestinians. And things like, shared high-tech projects and innovation projects. And, those are the kinds of things that the world needs and each side needs separately. And so if they, can find a way to cooperate, and they need that cooperation to do them, which certainly in the case of climate and environment is a no-brainer. I think that those should be an increasing focus of what we try to do to bring people together. They have a lot more interest in not screwing it up.
Thanks, Talia. We got a question for you, Haroon, from Ismail Sidic. And it is, do you think that the new coalition in Bosnia, which is likely to take power soon, will open some controversial questions regarding Middle Eastern relations, including strengthening ties with Israel, something that SNSD and HDZ have been doing for years? Your thoughts?
Crystal,
and we have one. I just want to say we have one more question from the audience that I want to get to before 1:30. Thank you. Go ahead.
When it comes to Bosnia's foreign policy, there's a very ambiguous dividing line between the tripartite presidency and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it's not really clear who handles it. Very often, the foreign minister will do things which, without the approval or without consulting with the tripartite presidency, and vice versa. When it comes to Bosnia's relations with Israel, since 2014, 2015, Dodik has been courting a number of figures within Israel, most primarily Avigdor Lieberman. Haaretz and the Jerusalem Post have reported on his secret meetings with Lieberman in Budapest and in Vienna. And I've also been told by a number of Bosnian intelligence officers that they have been meeting in Banja Luka and in Montenegro as well. More recently, Dragan Čović, the president of the Croatian Democratic Party, HDZ, has realized the importance of having Israel on his side. In fact, this year alone, both Dodik and Čović visited Israel and paid their respects at Wadi Hashem. Now, the question is, why don't Bosnian Muslim leaders visit Israel and establish closer ties with the Israelis? I've been asking them for quite a number of years, and this is something I really don't understand. Bosnian Muslim politicians do not understand the importance of having Israel as an ally. Do not understand the importance of maintaining, the narrative of there's so many similarities in the Bosnian genocide survival and in the story of and that of the Holocaust as well. So, but Bosnian Muslims do not seem to understand why this is important, and I'm afraid that they are losing this game to Dodik and Čović. Dodik is playing on the fears of certain right-wing, Dodik and Čović both are playing with the fears of certain right-wing Israelis who, by depicting Bosnian Muslims as Islamic radicals, they try to find common ground with right-wing Israelis. And I'm not sure where this is really how this is gonna end up. But it's not going in a good way, definitely. But I was hoping for Bosnian Muslims, and in fact, I recommended to a number of people in the Islamic community as well. I suggested that they visit Israel and establish closer ties, but apparently this has thus far fallen on deaf ears.
Yeah, well, I had an interesting summer. Actually, Ralph Beirovich and I co-authored a piece in Haaretz about Israel's meddling in Bosnia's, unbelievable electoral law reform that has, turned into, as we would say in Army talk, a big goat rope. That now the Christian Schmidt, the High Representative, is being summoned to Brussels and cancels on testifying about what he did and why he did it to advance the interests of HDZ. And so Israel, it was a technical government at the time, and I was like I actually reached out to Dalia and said, what is going on here? This is so crazy. That this errant ambassador assigned to Balkan countries at large was emailing media outlets in Belgrade from Gmail accounts on a quote unquote a leaked memo where Israel didn't consult with the president of the Jewish community even in Bosnia, who was completely shocked by this encroachment on domestic politics. To the credit of Yair Lapid, he admonished this ambassador and pulled him from his post. But nonetheless, what was the strategic purpose of this? Any comments, Dalia or Kurt or anybody?
I would just say that I have to say that I'm confessing I don't know anything about the inside story, but from reading about it, from what I know of the details and from reading your article, I have to say that I hope nobody gets mad at me. I think it sounded like a lot of incompetence. It sounded like somebody, because the person sitting there in Tirana, right? Wasn't that the ambassador?
Right. Yeah.
Has no real understanding of of Bosnia. Listen, it's hard for people to understand Bosnia, but that is an ambassador's job. And I think that person that they just really had no clue of what they were getting involved in.
Right. Well, that's an unfortunate dalliance by Israel. And then, I actually was contacted by somebody who had written a journal article about Israel selling arms to Serbia during the war. And he was, and actually it's true that actually, absolutely quite documented.
Well, documented to the extent that it can, because some of the information is still not released by the censor.
Yeah. So anyway, that pulls up a whole bunch of bad stuff for people to again grind up and chew out. And just to say, following up on Dalia's earlier comments about what this Netanyahu government is going to mean for progressive Jews in the United States, I can tell you, I work at 2 universities. I dread the establishment of this government and what is going to play out on campuses across the country because of the BDS movement. It has its fits and starts, but with Netanyahu running that government, I really do dread this situation from a domestic consumption of Israeli politics in the American context. One more question, and this will be the last question. It's not directed at anybody in particular, but it's the question is, isn't demography a major difference between the 2 regions? High fertility in most of MENA versus low fertility in most of the Western Balkans, net immigration to the Gulf states, and I think Israel versus net immigration from all of the Western Balkans. Is this a valid basis to view the Western Balkans as a region in decline and MENA as a region on the rise? Let me just say very quickly, we know how climate is driving people from MENA actually to the Balkans for summer. They call them climate change tourists. There's a whole congregation outside of Sarajevo where there's all these houses and they're all coming to Bosnia. And there's been some concern about that. So Haroon, you want to make a short comment? We'll go around.
The thing is, most Gulf, middle class and upper middle class Gulf families have the habit of having a summer home. And before the Arab Spring, they would mostly go to have their homes, in Syria, in the mountains of Syria, in Lebanon, or even in Morocco. After the Arab Spring began, all the unfolding unrest, they began searching for new locations. And of course, Bosnia popped up, Turkey popped up.
Yep.
But Bosnia was far cheaper than Turkey. So they began, real estate and, building houses or buying apartments. So they would spend their, summer months, June, July, August in Sarajevo and enjoy the 34, 35 degrees temperature instead of the 49 degrees in Kuwait, Qatar, and the Emirates. Of course, Bosnians generally are very xenophobic, including Bosnian Muslims. So the sight of women wearing niqabs and bearded men was quite disturbing to some Bosnian Muslims. There was a lot of negative reactions. There was even more negative reactions from media outlets in Zagreb and Belgrade, calling this, accusing Arab tourists of disseminating Salatism and so on and so forth, which I found really ridiculous. But anyway, this trend has been going on and until about 2017 and 2018. Now it is reducing definitely. Now they're turning more towards purchasing apartments in Istanbul, outside actually Istanbul. But we still have about 20 to 30,000 tourists, mostly from the UAE and KSA, visiting Bosnia on an annual basis. I'm not sure you can, what the questioner asked about, low fertility rates in the Balkans and high fertility rates in the MENA region. This would be somewhat an oversimplification. I'm not sure we can word it in such a way, but definitely, there are. These are 2 interconnected geopolitical spaces. There's a lot of communication. But people in Bosnia, for the first time, they realized that there was a war in Syria only in 2015. Why? Because they saw hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees walking by foot from Turkey across Greece, North Macedonia, Serbia, through Bosnia, and on their way towards Austria and Germany. And they asked me, why are these Syrians walking through Bosnia? I told them because there's a goddamn war in Syria raging since 2011. And nobody apparently paid attention to these wars until they saw these Syrian refugees passing through their own country.
Thank you. Do you have any comments on that, Diana, and about that effect? Fertility is just one data set, but
yeah. Yes. I was just going to say, the fertility alone doesn't also give us an entire, a full picture of like population makeup in these places, especially with respect to Israel. We also know, we know that just as much there is immigration, there's also emigration all the time, especially with respect to like liberal Israelis who are actually sort of, throwing in the towel and saying like, nothing's been changing. And so, I don't know, we'll move to Berlin. And so I mean, it's a more complex, I think, picture than fertility, with respect to population, than fertility alone can tell us. But of course, all of it has implications for even, I don't know, what I look at, which is intergroup relations.
Sure. Thank you, Kurt.
Very quickly, just an observation on that, and it follows on what Diana just said. At least in my experience, there's a differential between the Yugoslavs, who tend to view their best days as behind them, almost universally in the region, and the sense of optimism that you feel in Albania and Kosovo. And that's not simply a fertility issue. I think it's also a reflection of politically where they were. But the same drivers for migration that Diana just mentioned about politics are definitely pertinent. The most liberal, most prospective people are leaving, and it's not just them, it's anybody with an opportunity to leave. Will do so because they don't see forward movement in the Western Balkans. And so I would say that that's a differential with a good chunk of at least the Gulf states.
Sure. Any last comment, Dalia?
Yeah, as a final thought, I guess I would have to pick up sadly on something Kurt just said about the optimism. I know what you mean in the past, but last time I was in Kosovo, which was not long ago, there was crushing pessimism everywhere I looked. And I think that we all know where it comes from, whether you're young or old. It's the pessimism of high hopes that have been disappointed. And and in Israel too, even though Israel has astronomically better indicators and socioeconomic indicators, the sense of democracy on the decline, unaccountable leadership, corruption in power, and the inability to move beyond, ethno-nationalist conflict, which even if you're not a peace supporter in Israel-Palestine, if you're on the hard right, you still feel this crushing sense of like, this is dominating our lives. I think these are the things that make people, lose a sense of engagement with their state and with their commitment to either being there physically, and if they can leave, or having any engagement with trying to improve, by joining politics or by being social activists, et cetera. They just become out of touch. And then of course it gets worse because there's even less accountability in that case. And that, is a sweeping statement, but I think it covers a lot of the areas we're talking about.
I would agree. Since I get the last word as the moderator, I'll just say, if you're a politician in the Balkans or anywhere, and you're talking about the past and you don't have a vision for the future, why should anybody remain? And that seems to be the case throughout the Balkans, unfortunately, using a cudgel against grievances from the past, bringing them back into the present, and not really creating a vision for a good quality of life and opportunity. I hope for more. I remain hopeful for more possibilities to emerge, but the pickings are quite slim. I want to thank each one of you. You've been wonderful. This has been a wide-ranging conversation, one that I know we've never had in the Balkan area at the Harriman Institute. I'm really grateful to each of you. Thank you so much for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you,
for
Tanya.
organizing.
Take care. See you soon, I hope.
Thank you.
See you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
But bye-bye.
Bye-bye.